Welcome to the Up Arrow podcast with William Harris, featuring top business leaders sharing strategies and resources to get to the next level. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hey everybody, William Harris here. I'm the founder and CEO of Element and the host of this podcast where I feature experts in the e-commerce industry sharing strategies on how to scale your business and achieve your goals. My guest today is Andy Heddle. Andy, do you go by Andy or Andrew? I've never asked you that.
You know, it's funny. Here in the US, I go by Andy, whereas in the UK, I go by Andrew. So I have a split personality.
Split personality, Andy Heddle, Andrew Heddle here. He heads up new business for Colaboratory. He's had a pretty varied career in e-commerce and digital strategy leading up to this. He was previously the head of D2C at VML and wrote the book D2C DNA. He's an absolute industry vet that I'm excited to learn more from him here as well. Somebody that I consider a friend. We've actually known each other for maybe 6 years or so, and just so much that we're excited to dig into. Andy, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get into the official questions here, I do want to at least announce that our sponsorship here. This episode is brought to you by Element. Element is an award-winning advertising agency optimizing e-commerce campaigns around profit. In fact, we've helped 13 of our customers get acquired, with the largest one selling for nearly $800 million. And we were ranked as the 12th fastest growing agency in the world by Adweek. That said, let's get into you, Andy, and Colaboratory. Tell me, for those who don't know, what is Colaboratory and what's the backstory? Why did this start in the first place? Where's the passion behind it?
Yeah, sure. So, thank you. So the very long story short is Colaboratory is a software as a service startup, which aims to make it easy for brands to find other brands to collaborate with. And particularly, these are marketing collaborations that we're thinking about. So things that the customer sees, feels, experiences, and hears. And the goal of those collaborations is to get attention for the brand in ways that isn't necessarily that easy to get attention. And obviously, that means an awful lot of earned media, and also just to raise the eyebrow of the customer. And when we raise the eyebrow of the customer, then we develop a more emotional, deeper connection. That's really the thought behind it. The challenge with brand-to-brand collaborations is more than anything finding partners to work with, and then getting the collab kind of established and off the ground. So that's really what we do. We help people deliver those things.
Yeah, and so let's talk about some of these collabs, because I feel like, we hear collabs and maybe it gets confused with other things like influencers or whatever, but what's an example of a great brand collab?
Yeah. Well, no, it's absolutely right. I mean, the funny thing, obviously, about the term collab or collaboration is it's a very fungible term. And everyone, to some extent, will use collab as a euphemism for us working together, even if you're paying me to work, with you. And so one of the things we say about collabs is a collab doesn't come with a rate card. Okay, you cannot buy a collab. You have to make a collab, and it's two parties at least and more making one together, which isn't to say that there aren't different levels of application and different levels of establishing the collab. But more or less, that's what distinguishes it from being a sponsorship or a licensing deal or, advertising or whatever it may be. So that's kind of how we think about it. In terms of brands that have done, great collabs, I mean, I think, people are always aware of the fashion brands that establish them. And they're often actually licensing deals kind of in disguise. But it makes a lot of sense if you have seasonality in your range. Collab's just a great way of doing and saying something a bit more interesting. So you'll typically find collabs and brand collabs in areas that are consumer-led and somewhat fashion-forward. So we see them a lot in sports, we see them a lot in entertainment, we see them in food, and obviously we see them in fashion. It's typically where you'll see them. And they very much lead the consumer by turning over product relatively quickly. So in terms of a great place to go and look, one of the people that we direct, one of the brands, I should say, we direct people to is a brand called Athletic Brewing. Athletic Brewing is a non-alcoholic beer brand. It's about 5 years old as a brand. And they have systematically and steadily developed collabs over the years to really punch above their weight in the marketplace. And beer is a pretty challenging marketplace to be in because it's a distribution-led business.
Sure.
And so the main breweries own the distribution. So to appear above the fold, you've really got to be doing something a little bit more interesting. And I think what's clever about what Athletic Brewing have done is they've done something that maybe the bigger breweries struggle to do. So in NA, the bigger breweries have devoted most of their energy and investment in what is a dramatically growing market. So really creating analogs of their already popular beers. So a classic example is Guinness Zero or Heineken Zero. These are beers that look and taste and smell a lot like the standard Heineken or the standard Guinness, but they're non-alcoholic. So they're just creating facsimiles. And that makes a lot of sense. But for Athletic to stand out as a non-alcoholic only brewery, they really are about turning over a lot of product and making the product seem really interesting. And so they've collabed with people like Laird Superfoods, Super Coffee to create the world's first ever pre-workout beer. They've collabed with, they collab with really anyone and everyone that has a really solid positioning in the outdoors, because the term athletic brewing at first blush seems like a bit of an oxymoron, but they really have been able to establish for themselves a positioning that no one else really has. And predominantly they've done it through collabs because they can't really do it through advertising.
Sure. And I think one of the things I remember when I started getting into some of these brand collabs with you was maybe thinking that this was just something relegated to bigger brands. That it's like, you see the Nikes and the Adidas of the world and all of these other brands that like you said, it's like, well, it makes sense that they're doing. I mean, McDonald's has done, let's just say influencer collabs, but those are like at that level of an influencer, that's their brand. And so those are, they're doing some brand collabs. And even musicians doing collabs. I'm thinking of, let's say you see somebody like Justin Bieber and, Fonzie or whatever doing the Despacito, right? And so, there's like these collabs, and it's the idea of bringing people together, and then you're exposing people to different markets and different audiences than what they normally would have. But this isn't just something that big players can play in. You were explaining to me that sometimes big players are looking for some of these smaller, more niche companies. Why? Tell me a little bit more about that.
So I think the reason they work really well, especially these kind of big, small kind of partnerships, is bigger brands have typically less room for maneuver. They've established a positioning over a very long period of time, and that positioning is very much ingrained in the audience's mind. And rather like a super tanker, once you've kind of got that weight of work, moving you forward, it can be quite hard to play around the edges and the margins. But they always want to be saying something interesting or showing a different light to the brand or shedding a different light on the brand. And smaller brands tend to have to develop credibility and authority in a niche. Mm-hmm. And so larger brands sometimes like to borrow some of that credibility from the relationship. And of course, smaller brands have nothing but upside for working with some of these bigger brands. So one of the things that we counsel the brands we work with is, there is no such thing as, a size match. Just because you're bigger or you're smaller doesn't mean you can't work with the other partner, because what you're actually developing is a story. And stories don't require, everyone has a number of followers on Instagram or whatever. They just need a narrative arc. And that's what smaller brands can sometimes really bring, is a developing story that just really enhances the larger brand.
Sure. Yeah, well, and so, what you mentioned that this is kind of similar to licensing, but it's different than licensing. What separates the two of these? If somebody's thinking, oh, we already do this because we do licensing with, these Star Wars products or whatever, what really makes this separate from just a typical licensing deal?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think there is overlap, and it would be wrong to say that there isn't. The challenge a little bit with licensing, especially brands that are really very established in the licensing arena, is you end up with a bit of a Me Too kind of product at the end of the day. Licensing tends to be, funnily enough, licensing deals are normally moderated and mediated by the legal team, not by the marketing team. And so what the legal team is looking to accomplish is a good spread of the brand. It appears in a lot of places, but it also ticks an awful lot of boxes around the brand presence, how the brand shows up. And so you tend to find that within pure licensing deals, they'll just look very simple. It's basically just badging. And maybe, a very, very seasonal. It'll come up around the launch of a film in the case of Star Wars or whatever it may be. And there isn't really a sense of creativity. It's really just leveraging, a name or a brand. But of course, they can look exactly like a normal collab, in the purest sense of the word. So ultimately, I think what will distinguish a collab is the work of the marketing teams to create some messaging, some story, and maybe a product that really changes a little bit the direction that both brands are going to.
And you brought up story, which is, you reminded me, you've got a lot of good aphorisms that I really appreciate. One of those was, what is it? Show the story, don't tell the story, right?
Yeah. And that's really, that's really a great point. So here's the thing that collabs do better than anything else is they show the story rather than tell the story. And sometimes it is much easier to tell a more nuanced story if you're showing it rather than just saying it and telling it. And there's two reasons for that. The first is when you tell a story, the customer has to be receptive. And that means that they have to, divest themselves of preconceptions they may have about your brand. Or you may have told the story so many times, they're no longer really hearing it. And so when you go and show it, you kind of demonstrate it in a visual way. You actually create a problem that psychologically the customer solves. And none of us really appreciate this about ourselves, but basically we're problem-solving machines. That's all human beings basically do all day, every day. And when we see something that doesn't initially make sense, because there's dissonance or there's two things that are being put together in a slightly odd pairing, when we see the thing that doesn't make sense, we automatically try and make sense of it. And in the act of making sense of it, we actually write ourselves into the story because we've made sense of it. And now we create a bond or an affinity with the brand that wasn't there necessarily otherwise. And that when collabs are really working, that's when you get this heightened sense of attraction to the brand. But obviously, likewise, if it doesn't make sense, then the collab has probably failed.
Well, there's power in the story aspect of it. It reminds me of there was a speaker that I saw, decades ago now, and it feels weird to even say that I can say something was decades ago. I'm at that stage. But there was a speaker, and I don't remember if it was either Ray Vanderlaan or Ken Ham. But he had us close our eyes and he was describing God. And he said, there's a difference in the way that sometimes the Western world describes God versus the Eastern way of thought. And he said, okay, as Westerners, we typically would say, oh, God is omniscient, omnipresent. And we describe God that way. And he said, I want you to close your eyes and picture omniscience. And it's like, you can't picture that. He said, an Eastern way of thinking is very much like God is bread, God is water. And it's like, you can close your eyes, you can instantly picture bread. And there's something about, that idea of show the story, don't tell the story, where, he even described where Jesus, I'm going off on a big tangent here, but Jesus, says, hey, are you guys blind? You have eyes, but don't see. And this was right after he fed the 5,000 with 2 loaves of bread and 5 fish. And then they get on the boat and they're worried about the storm. And he says, you're blind, or you have eyes, but you can't see. And they're like, what? And rather than explaining it, they get off the boat. And the very next passage is he gives a blind guy eyes. And he says, I see people walking about as trees. And they're like, eyes, but can't see. Got it. He shows it instead of tells it. And there's power in that. And I think that we miss that sometimes in all of our long form copy or things along those lines.
Yeah, that's right, because it reaches beyond the rational, but it's funny. The big key to it is this idea of resolving the tension. And that's that. The more I've looked at collabs, and I've been in the collab game, for professionally at least for over a year now, the more I realize that all creativity is just a person or a brand or whoever it may be making sense of the world, outwardly. Whether they do that through art, whether they do that through writing, whether they do that through film, whatever it may be. Film director is actually just, whilst they're telling a story, they're actually making sense of the world, or at least a corner of the world. And I think one of the things that we see with collabs, it makes them actually really exciting for brand marketers, is a brand marketer should fall more in love, if that's possible, with their brand through doing a brand collab than not. And the reason for that is they get their brand through a different set of eyes, which is a set of eyes that they would never see that brand through otherwise, because it's separate and different and just sits off to the side of what they do day to day. And so actually we have a kind of a collab strategy session that we use with our bigger clients. And more or less what we're inviting them to do is to re-experience the brand that they work on day in, day out with a completely, we try to find 5 different sets of perspectives, so that may be the perspective of the non-profit, or it may be the perspective of, I'll take one of our gym clients that we had. We actually went down a beverage track with the gym client, but we also went down a basketball track with them. Those are very, very different things, but you get to look in at the brand with these different perspectives. And armed with those different perspectives, creativity comes up because you're trying again to just make sense of the world, And so one of our aphorisms is, when you're looking to see whether a collab is going to excite people, is to basically show that, the collab will make more sense of the brand, not less. So if someone goes, I don't get it, then that'll end up being a bad collab. But if someone goes, now I get it, then it'll end up being a good collab. But you need it. If someone gets it immediately, like, oh yeah, whatever, like a licensing deal, then the collab hasn't done its work. There's too much synergy, and there's no energy. The dissonance is where the energy is. Okay.
Sure.
But of course, if there's too much dissonance, then there's no energy either. It's like without, I don't know enough about physics, to know really what I'm talking about. But for things to kind of generate energy, there has to be some dissonance, but not too much and not too little. So another one of ours is, synergy and energy are not the same thing. And yet, quite often marketers will come into the meeting looking for synergies. And those synergies may be comparable size, or it may be that we're exactly aligned on our values, or exactly aligned on who our, ideal customer profile is, or whatever it may be. And what we'll go looking for is actually some dissonance, not extreme, but enough.
Yeah, it's like a tango, right? Like there needs to be this dance that takes place that makes you say, "Oh, this is exciting. This is intriguing. I need to see more about what's going on here." I can see the value of that, and maybe that's a good way for us to lean into. You've got a lot of great examples of collabs on your website, things like that. There's got to be at least one that you feel like just inspires you, and you're like, this one is a work of art. Is there a collab that you feel like this one spoke to me very well?
That's a good question. I should have probably gone on my website and gone through it in detail. Funnily enough, one of the simplest ones, and it's honestly not really a collab, which is kind of a funny thing about it. But Mint Mobile and Arizona Iced Tea made kind of a collab ad. And the long story short was Mint Mobile was trying to express the fact that they were never going to change the price of their monthly contract, which I think was $14.99. And turns out Arizona Iced Tea has never, ever over 30 years put up the price of its main 16-ounce.
I didn't realize that.
Simple iced tea. It was 99 cents in the early 90s, and it's in 1992. It's 99 cents today, which makes it sound like it must have been pretty expensive in 1992, but fine. They hadn't changed the price in that whole time. And so, Ryan Reynolds in his inimitable style.
Brilliant. Oh, he's brilliant. Yes.
He brought in the CEO of Arizona Iced Tea as a kind of a grizzled veteran of the beverage world, and basically said that he wanted to inherit some of his inflation-busting DNA, and this is how they're going to do it. And then they talked about basically the fact that it is possible never to raise a price. Here's the proof. Now you can make the promise, but you also need to show the proof. Well, in making the promise, they showed the proof, and the proof was Arizona iced tea. And so they kind of put the two together on the art card at the end. And what was funny about it was they put the two prices of their products together. So these can be bought as a collab, but they're in different aisles of Target. One's in this aisle and one's in the other. So, but the way they mushed it together, they made it, they were talking like it was a collab.
Yeah.
But it was really, it wasn't really, but it was just clever. And again, that was, I think, one of those moments where for me, I thought, showing it enables you to prove it. Like you can promise, but can you prove? And the collab, in a funny kind of way, you delivered the proof.
Well, and I love it because that's, to me, one of the brilliant things about a collab is reaching an entirely different, group of people necessarily. Whereas, like you said, if it's too much synergy, then it's just like, well, yeah, sure, duh. But I would not have thought to take Arizona iced tea and a phone company, a mobile phone company, Mint Mobile. I wouldn't have thought that it's like, hey, we need to like collaborate and do some kind of like, marketing together. That's the furthest thing from my mind. But I think that's that idea of where you just talked about, like there's energy though. Maybe not synergy where it's like, duh, of course they're going to do that. But there's some energy. What about an example of a bad collab? What's an example of one that you're like, this is one where it did not have the intended effect of what it was supposed to do. It kind of flopped, or maybe we don't know if it flopped, but you would assume that it would have based on what you saw.
Yeah, I think, funny enough, most collabs are successful across the dimension that the collab needs to be successful, which is really just getting attention, and typically some sort of unpaid earned attention. We were talking about it. It's been successful. It isn't necessarily successful in terms of sales. It's not necessarily successful in terms of a brand necessarily even generating more affection. But it has it broken out and made some attention. So we often look at a collab and think, if it didn't really break out and get any attention, then it didn't succeed. The good news, of course, is if it didn't get any attention, no one noticed, so you can just do the next one and we carry on. On rare occasions, you get bad attention, but most collabs succeed at least along some sort of dimension. So what I think that didn't, and I think it's maybe become a little bit notorious for not succeeding, is the collab that Warby's did with Arby's going back, I think it's 2017, going back a few years. So Warby's obviously kind of a millennial, upper level, glasses brand. Arby's is the opposite of that. So you can be sure they weren't looking for synergy at that point. And the goal of the collab was actually quite a thoughtful goal. It was to raise money to provide glasses for underprivileged people. And so that was really the whole goal of the collab. And so they actually created a range of food items at Warby's that were fashioned around glasses, and glass items that were fashioned around Arby's food products. The most notable of which was a monocle that was in the shape of an onion ring.
Oh, that's
kind of the idea. Yeah, it's kind of the idea. And you kind of get it. What I think was interesting was it was kind of patronizing. And it came off as patronizing to Warby's really took a lead on it. And it was kind of the jokes on Arby's. And Warby's is making the joke. And you can do that the other way around, but you can't joke down, but you can joke up, And so when they created the collab, everything they put out around this collab was really like, Warby's, Arby's, it's kind of funny because the name's quite, similar. Oh, and Arby's is a little bit, crap. And Warby's is a little bit cool. So, Warby's is blessing Arby's with its coolness. And it's the wrong way around. And so it didn't really get the traction that maybe it would have deserved. Because or could have done, or they also didn't put the money rate, the charitable aspect front and center. it was really like, oh, we had this clever marketing idea that no one, we probably should never have had, and we ran with it. But
Sure.
it was always articulated very much from the Warby's point of view. And I don't know, it didn't feel like the right tension. It felt like the wrong tension. And come back to this thing, as a customer, you're trying to resolve these tensions. If you resolve the tension, it's kind of like, oh, that was a bit patronizing towards Arby's and their customers. Then you just don't feel that good about it,
Sure.
So it is a bit of a watch out, because if you're going to engage in this activity, you have to ultimately, the customer has to feel good about that resolution. They have to feel like they're on the right side of the resolution.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about brainstorming some of these ideas. Because there's one thing that you said that I liked is, it's an unpaid thing. It's not like you're doing, paid ads where you say, let's just scale our advertising by another, 25% to grow or whatever. This is, there's costs involved in, let's just say, producing the items or things like that. But it's not a paid acquisition tactic necessarily. And I think there's some excitement about that, because as we get into this year, 2023, it's been interesting. Demand is down for a lot of people and a lot of products and segments right now. Buyer demand is down a bit. There's this allure of this could be a really good way for brands who have maybe been struggling, maybe stale, like you said, maybe need reinvigorated to go down this path. And you don't want me being the one coming up with your brand collabs. If you're not familiar, and I'll probably link to this here, I came up with an absolutely ridiculous idea for a brand collab, which was, if you're familiar with Loom, there's the video capture tool, Loom Video. And I said, hey, okay, so if you capture this Loom, and we use it in business all the time, right? If you capture this Loom and somebody on your team does something with the Loom and they produce something as a result of that, that would be the fruit of the Loom. So let's have a collaboration with Loom Video and Fruit of the Loom underpants. And I'm completely joking about it. It got a lot of attention on LinkedIn, which was pretty funny. But that's a bad idea of a collab. But how would people go about coming up with good ideas? Ideally they can come and reach out to you. But aside from that, how do they even begin to think like, hey, there's some ideas that we could do? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think that what we endeavor to do with brands, anyone can do, is don't start with the brand. And it's literally the number one thing that people go for, is they'll say, okay, let's say we want a collab we want to collab with people that have got a great reputation for sports, athletics.
Okay.
So we want to collab with LeBron. Okay, because of course you do,
Sure, right.
And then you want to collab with Adidas or whatever.
I like LeBron. Let's stick with that. I'm from Canton, Ohio. He's from Akron, Ohio. We're the same age. We're basically best friends. So let's stick with LeBron. I like that. And
here's the problem with that, is that now you've instantly constrained your thinking.
Sure.
Because you put an absolute name on it. And what you haven't done is you haven't actually opened up your thinking to, okay, but what is LeBron signifying? What is he bringing? And so where we start with clients is we start with this and we go looking for territories. And so what we're endeavoring to do is have the client go back to brass tacks with their brand and kind of think about the feelings that they want their brand to evoke. And the things that their brand has stood for and they want it to stand for in the future. So open up those territories. And so in the case of one of the one of the gym chains we work with, what is the feeling they want to evoke? Well, this particular chain, their big thing is they do group exercise, and they want to evoke a feeling of community and togetherness and doing it together, because that's really what they do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we've got our territories. Okay. So what does doing it together involve? And, what is the end-to-end continuum of doing it together? Well, part of doing it together is there's obviously, before, there's during, and there's after. There's these different, parts of the experience. So how do people come together at the start? How do they, prep for, their session? What do they do in the session? And then, how do they how do they recover and come down afterwards? And you kind of start to really feel into the territories of where that makes the most difference. And funnily enough, we came up with a number of territories for them, one of which was housing. And another one was actually non-alcoholic beverages. Now, housing and non-alcoholic beverages could not be further apart. But why did we come up with housing? Well, we came up with housing for two reasons. Number one, an insight that they had about their brand is that their people who live in apartment blocks tend to have a more collegiate approach to life, just generally. Yeah, because they ride up and down elevators together.
Sure.
They're often at a similar stage of life. And this particular chain, their core customer is like 18 to 30. They're a similar stage of life. They're kind of single, but live in community. Unlike families who tend to be live in community, but relatively, they don't expand out of that community necessarily. So they're singles, but they live in community. Well, then people who are single live in community. What kind of places do they live? And, how you sleep and the quality of your accommodation has a direct impact on your health. And so you began to explore these territories. When you find your way into a place you just would not have found your way into otherwise, and then start looking for brands in that space that can communicate that story, that healthy living is a 24/7 activity. And
Sure.
what's the name of our gym? 24-hour. So away we go. There's a lot you can do there. But we haven't started with a brand. We started with the ethos of the brand.
Sure.
And then on the non-alcoholic beer side or non-alcoholic beverage side is well, how do you wind down after the activity? Yeah, well, NA beer is a really, really growing market. And why not hang out at the gym and have a beer? And then the other thing is, of course, if it's non-alcoholic beer, guess what? You can drink it 24 hours a day. Yeah, because you can have a beer for breakfast if it's non-alcoholic.
Sure.
And, and in Europe, where I come from, non-alcoholic beer has been a big thing for forever. I mean, literally forever. And the German biathlon team is sponsored by a non-alcoholic beer brand, and they use it as a recovery.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
So, and in the Berlin Marathon is sponsored by a non-alcoholic beer brand, and every finisher gets a liter of a non-alcoholic beer because it puts in electrolytes after you finish the race. So we're able to play with these, but the absolute key thing is just go and have fun with the brand and see what are the territories, see what the range of emotions and feelings you can have around the things that you're trying to express. Then you're bound to end up with, as you can see, widely divergent ideas, and you worry about the brands later. Because the problem is if you find a brand, I want to partner with that brand, then you instantly constrained it down. And now it's actually about, do they fancy me as much as we fancy them? It's a swipe right, swipe left thing. And, and that'll end up being disappointing in most cases, And I could go on. Fun enough, we were talking to another firm recently, and they want to say security without being scary. They believe their product line delivers security. Well, what is a comfortable sense of security? And before long, you kind of end up with, blankets and, smells and various other things. Certain things smell sick, or they evoke that feeling, and, blankets and things evoke that feeling of security when you're young. And even though, they don't protect in the same way, they offer a sense of protection. So, and it's funny, this particular brand had come to us with, could we do a collab with a security company? And one of the experiences a lot of people have with security companies is that they make them scared because they look like they're ready for violence.
Absolutely.
And I kind of come back to the point. I know I've rattled on a bit, but
I love it.
Thinking about collabs should be the most fun thing you do on any given day. And not because you might get to, hit a home run and, set the fireworks off because you've got this really big brand. In fact, that can be almost the worst thing that can happen to you. It's actually because you've been able to review and relook at your brand in ways that make you feel a much deeper understanding of it and more affection for it as well.
Mm-hmm. This reminds me, I've got young kids. Well, they're getting older, 13, 10, and 7. But it reminds me of like play dates. Essentially what you're doing is it's like, as little brand, it's like picture your brand as like this kid and you're just like, hey, who do I want my brand hanging out with and playing with? And it's like, hey, I don't want my brand playing with this kid, but this kid, they're a good kid. This kid's throwing sand in people's eyes. Let's not hang out with that kid. But like you said, it should be the most fun. It's like play dates. Let's set up some good play dates and let's have some fun. And that's a good way to look at it.
I'll give you another top tip. This is an absolute top tip that every brand should, is like, seek first to serve and not to be served.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? As a principle, when it comes to brand collabs, who would benefit from collabing with you that you would love to benefit in the marketplace? Think about that.
Great way to look at it.
And then when you've thought about that, approach that brand and see if they'll collab with you. I guarantee you they're going to be interested, because you'll have done them a favor that they wouldn't have ever asked for.
Sure.
And then you'll develop your collab chops just from working with these other brands. And believe you me, if you develop those and, you kind of create a strategy and doing them kind of consistently, the brands you want to work with will come calling because they'll see what you've done for others.
That's brilliant.
And so many people start with, I want to collab with the biggest partner I can to get the biggest sugar rush I possibly can to advance my career.
Dopamine, yay!
Yeah, exactly. But if you come at it the other way, you'll find it a lot easier to find collab partners. You'll develop that collab muscle and then let the people you want, to collab with come to you. It's an absolute, that's a promise that will work.
I like that. Andy, this is fun to go on that. I know that we're getting close on our time here and I want to make sure that I get in. I like a little bit about like, who is Andy Heddle? There's something about getting into like the backstory of you as well. And one of the things that I think we were talking about was just what makes you tick. Obviously, you've found a way of being able to take like very disparate things and come and join them and merge them together. Why? What is there something in your childhood that made you that type of person who's able to do this type of work?
Yeah, it's a good question. And to some extent, you never really know.
Sure.
But I one of the things I know is distinctive. I know, because I would even notice this when I was quite young. My mother was a journalist, and I would say she was quite liberal. My father was a politician, like a member of the British Parliament. So that's the equivalent of being a senator / in the House of Representatives.
Sure.
And I'd say he was quite conservative with a small c. And so I grew up around a kitchen table there was always a hot debate going on forever.
Sure.
About whatever the political issue of the day was. And there was never agreement. But there was never arguing and shouting. There was only ever discussion and reason. And it's really funny because I look back on it and it is actually quite remarkable. It's been my experience that my family, it was just the norm to debate everything and never to fall out over it. No, it wouldn't even occur to you. And it's funny because even as a young child, I would go to other people's houses and one or other of the parents would say their piece and that was it. That was the law on the topic. Or people would row or fall out, or they wouldn't even discuss it at all. Like, they would just discuss whatever, something very, very uncontroversial. Well, I grew up in a place where there was, and it's almost impossible to have a non-controversial conversation because no one would let you. And yet it was quite, we were trying to work out what's the truth,
Sure.
And so I suppose that has conditioned a lot because I do seem to be able, I ended up doing philosophy at university. And I think in part, I was able to sit there and evaluate and understand and kind of go down rabbit holes without feeling that my identity was on the line, and I think that's a challenge, challenge that we see, especially now
absolutely
throughout, is people feel their identity's on the line just to explore a topic, and that's, and I think where that's helped from a from a marketing perspective is I can hold disparate points of view all the
Hmm.
time. But then you start to see dots, you can join dots as well, you
Yeah.
know. But also I don't feel a particular compunction to be right because, to some extent you're never actually right.
Sure.
You're just one version of wrong. And, and which hopefully is
That's
a better
fair.
version of the other available options.
Well, I like even just how you worded that, and I think that's an important thing to make sure that we call out was there was an emphasis on being able to explore opposite points of view without calling out your identity. I think that's a really huge thing that you just said. I don't want to pass over that because I feel like to your point that is a thing that is a really hard thing to do right now, where people are afraid to express what's in maybe their heart or their mind, and sometimes that's how we have to work through things to get to a better understanding, is to have these conversations, and those conversations are arguably harder to have in many ways than they have been in a while. And so I think that there's something to what you're saying there, being able to have those
Yeah.
conversations without falling out, but being able to have those conversations.
Well, it's funny because I think in part, one of the struggles that we all have, and we see it kind of play out in our careers and everywhere really, is you don't really have the freedom to be wrong
Hmm.
without suffering condemnation. And at the same time, we're living in an era where there are so many different ideas and thoughts and perspectives that are actually available to us at any one time.
Hmm.
And even if you go on platforms that people think, there's a lot of thought control on, actually, when you look at the variety of ideas, it's astonishing. But you have to then be able to, be able to wrestle with them
Hmm.
and not be called out for being wrong just because you're one point or other on your journey, you know.
Sure.
And so, and that's hard to, it's kind of hard to escape. But you have to give yourself, I think we all of us do ourselves the favor of not having to be declarative about absolutely everything and not having to be right, and realizing that, that we have some inherent biases and we're probably going to be wrong about a lot of,
Absolutely.
you know, and, 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 and you can forgive yourself for that,
Have
as you think.
compassion for yourself and compassion for your fellow human beings who are maybe not as far along on this journey as you are, and haven't had the time or chance to explore the different things that you have. And so yeah, have compassion on yourself, that you
Yeah.
will learn and grow and get better, and have compassion for the people around you as well. And yeah, I think that's a really good point.
And funnily enough,
um
they may be much further along in their journey. You just haven't caught up yet. And you don't know.
yeah.
That's the other thing. I'll tell you
Yep.
one thing. I mean, you know, I'm not really, my predominant background is sales one way or another,
Sure.
and particularly digital sales, e-commerce. And I wouldn't describe myself as being like a full stack marketer and someone with a great, deep marketing background. But one thing I think everyone should at least try to understand the overall principles of marketing, because the fundamental principle of marketing is to walk in someone else's shoes.
Sure.
That's the fundamental principle. If you can't do that, you cannot market. You cannot be a marketer. Um, and it's funny because I think
Yeah.
a mistake a lot of marketers make sometimes is to think that they are the customer.
Mm.
The minute you think you're the customer, you will cease to be a good marketer for sure,
Sure.
because you won't see that other people have different perspectives on exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
You start to come down, to a very synthesized point of view instead of a more, more broader understanding of what you're doing. So, and
Brilliant.
I think it's just good discipline for people to think, hey, I got to take a product that I've never touched, never like. I was a VMLY&R for 4.5 years, and in the morning you'd be talking about horse worming products. In the afternoon you'd be talking about Wendy's.
Sure.
Um, we had to be able to shift between those two, and that's a different customer.
Yeah.
And in fact, the Wendy's morning customer is different to the Wendy's evening customer. So, do you know
Sure.
what I mean? We've got to be able to flip around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I could talk to you about this for another hour, but I know that you actually have a hard stop. So I want to wrap it up with this. I like talking about show and tell of like, weird quirks, show and tell, things along those lines. And you mentioned something to me that I thought was very funny and interesting that I would not have ever thought of. When you travel, what's the odd thing that you do when you travel?
So I would buy a kettlebell wherever I go in the world and have it shipped to wherever I'm staying. So whether that's a hotel or an Airbnb or wherever, I just love working out with kettlebells. And typically, at home I have, I've probably got about. I collect kettlebells like some people collect watches, but I must have about 15 at home, different weights and just different feels and sizes and just whatever. And I must have left, I've left tens of these things around the world. Wherever I go, I want to have, and it'll typically at a minimum be a 36-pound kettlebell or 16-kilogram kettlebell if it's, in a country with kilograms. And I will happily leave them there when I am done with them. Even if I'm there for a day or two, it's fine.
Sure.
Leave them for the next person to come along and experience the joy of the kettlebell. So, it's funny because I've gone to places again, like years later, and found the kettlebell that I bought is still there.
That's hilarious.
And we'll get to use it. So
there's a collab waiting to happen right there. If any kettlebell company wants to work with Andy, I feel like you need to almost sign these when you leave, and somebody's gonna be like, "Oh, that's an original Andy Heddle. Wow, where did you get that one?" If people wanted to learn more about you, stay in touch, they wanted to work with you, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, so Colaboratory's website is colaboratory.io, and Colaboratory is spelled with one L, so it's COLABORTARY .io.
It's like Colaboratory. Yeah.
Colaboratory, yeah, .io. When you get onto colaboratory.io, I will not let you get off that site without leaving your email address for me, because there's an email catcher form everywhere you look and turn. In terms of, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Andrew Heddle on LinkedIn. Very findable on LinkedIn, and I will respond positively to any outreach.
Awesome. Andy Heddle, if you do get a chance, you got to go follow him. Couple of things that didn't come up here. I at least just want to call this out before we leave. You helped launch some really good stuff with Oreos when they did like the Oreo record. There's just so many fun, fascinating things that you could learn by just following what he's done. Like I said, he's an industry vet. He has been doing this for years, and he's got so much knowledge and experience that if you don't go follow him, I would be disappointed. So please go follow him, check him out. Andy, thank you so much for joining, and everyone out there, thank you very much for listening in.
Hey, and thank you. This was a lot of fun. So I appreciate the opportunity.
See ya.
Thanks for listening to the Up Arrow podcast with William Harris. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.